Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to one of our WAMinars, which is on language and disability. My name is Karen McGrotty, and I'm the Employment Manager here at Ahead. So thank you very much for joining us today, and for those that have joined us before, welcome back, and for those that haven't joined us before, you're very welcome. So Tanisha, could you please move on to the next slide, where I'll just kind of talk you through some of the accessibility features we have here today at the webinar. So we have captioning available for attendees. So if you click on the CC button or the live transcript button on your device, that will kind of have captions pop up. We have Tanisha on technical. So she will be sharing some links in the chat and kind of responding to some of your questions in the chat box as well. We do have a Q&A feature. So if you do have any questions for any of our speakers and panelists today, please try to use that feature for a specific question. It just makes it easier for us to keep on track of the questions because the chat box can get really busy. And then if you are using the chat box, please feel free to do so. Just make sure it says everyone and not just to the hosts and panelists if you want to chat with other attendees. And then use the hashtag, so hashtag WAMinar. We have over 250 people registered today. And I suppose just to get a sense of who's in the room watching, or who's in the virtual room watching us today, I'm going to ask my colleague Tanisha to launch the first poll. And the poll is really just to get a sense of who you are. So Tanisha, if you wouldn't mind launching that poll. So there's two questions here, so please select the option most appropriate to you. You work in HR, you're the designated disability or access officer, you're a hiring manager, a line manager, a regular employee, and then what sector do you work in? So is it public employer, higher education, further ed, NGO or not-for-profit or other? So while you're kind of all voting on that, I can see we have about over 100 people watching here today, so we'll just kind of let that kind of roll. For those that are engaging with us for the very first time today, Ahead is an organisation that works to create inclusive environments in education and employment for people with disabilities. We've been around since 1988, and I suppose the WAM programme, or Willing Able Mentoring Programme, has been around since 2005, and we are funded by the Department of Social Protection. And what WAM does is WAM works with employers who provide paid graduate level internships for graduates with disabilities by ring-fencing roles for at least a minimum of 6 months. To date, we placed over 550 graduates, and about 80% of our graduates secure full-time work as a direct result of their placements. We currently have opportunities open for graduates with disabilities, so please do share it with your network. We have an opportunity open with the National Treasury Management Agency for next year's graduate programme, and we have 2 roles with AbbVie, their pharmaceutical company. So one role is sales and marketing, and the other one's a chemical engineer. We will be having more roles advertised in the next few weeks, so we would really appreciate you sharing that amongst people who may be qualified for those roles. So Tanisha, if you wouldn't mind stop sharing, and if you could share the results. So just kind of to share the results on the screen. So about 26% of people work in HR, 14% are a designated disability or access officer, 4% are a hiring manager, 15% said they're a line manager, nearly 50% said they're a regular employee. And in terms of sector, we actually have a really good split between public and private employers. So we have 28% saying they're from a public employer, 26% saying they're private. In terms of higher education, we have 16% representatives here, further ed 7%, and we have 25% from a not-for-profit or an NGO. So I'll just stop sharing that. So I suppose today's webinar is really a conversation around language and disability, particularly when it comes to employment and how to promote disability in the workplace. In our recent employer attitude survey, we found that 79% of employers have a D&I strategy that make reference to people with disabilities, and 24% of employers have a specific resource for disability. But we know there are still, I suppose, some stigma, or maybe employers are unsure of what language to use when referring to people with disabilities or disabled people, because it does traditionally carry a negative connotation. So first up, we have Dr. Shivaun Quinlivan, who is Vice Dean for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in the College of Business, Public Policy and Law at NUI Galway. So Shivaun, could you turn on your camera and turn on your mic, and you could share your screen?
I'm just, oh yeah, I will. I'll share a screen. Hold on now.
No problem. You're very welcome this morning, Shivaun. Thank you so much for giving up your time.
I want to see, are you getting what I'm seeing now? Are you getting the PowerPoint?
We can, if you can just play from the start, that would be great. Yeah, all good to go. Yeah.
So firstly, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I have worked with AHEAD for many, many years now. They're one of the organizations I really enjoy working with. So thank you again to Caroline and team for inviting me along. So the topic today is language and disability. And yes, Caroline fortunately gave the mouthful that is my title. But basically I'm a law lecturer, and my area of expertise is equality law with a specific focus on reasonable accommodation and disability in education and employment rights. So I've worked in this area for quite a time, and the topic today is language and disability. And I suppose really I'm going to bring us back a little bit first and to understand how we got to the legal definitions we have and why we're using the terms we're using. So disability as a concept, historically, we've looked at it through this kind of prism of medicalization, which is known as the medical model of disability. And the focus is often on what's wrong with the individual. So if we look at this image of the gentleman trying to get to the polling station, looking at the medical model, we see that the polling station is equally accessible to, well, it's not equally accessible, it's accessible. It's open to everybody. But the focus, if you look at the medical model, is on what's wrong with this individual. So he can't walk and therefore he can't get up the steps. So how do we fix him and find the solutions around that? And historically, that's how we have addressed the issue of disability. In the kind of, I suppose, 80s and 90s, there was a move in how we started to think, and it's that this move towards the social model, and I'll explain why this becomes important in a while. So this social model of disability, the focus is on the barriers to participation. So in this instance, if we look at the social model and apply that to this situation, well, the problem are the steps, not the individual. The problem is, what is the barrier to his participation? He's entitled to vote the same as everybody else, but we have put a barrier, an unnecessary barrier in his way. So the focus is, for the social model, is to focus on the barriers to participation. And they can be physical, very obvious in this case, the steps, but they can also be attitudinal and societal. So they're broader than just the physical barriers that we traditionally associate with disability. And this is a focus on a rights-based approach to inclusion, that people have the right to be included, as everybody has within society, and therefore we're focused on it from that perspective. Now this becomes important because this is what I suppose guides the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, and in turn that is guiding our legal norms. And so we need to be conscious of that. There are different legislative approaches to defining disability, and it does depend in large part on the purpose of that legislation. And I suppose, therefore, we have to look at legislation and think, well, what is the purpose of the legislation? And in the context of some positive action legislation, for example, you may decide that you want to provide a tax-free allowance for somebody who uses a mobility adapted car. Well, then you need to define disability in that context in a particular way, because you're targeting people who are mobility impaired. So somebody who has a different disability, like let's say ADHD or dyslexia, wouldn't need to avail of that. But what we're talking about here is anti-discrimination legislation. And so we need to think about, what is the purpose of anti-discrimination legislation? What's the reason for it? And it's to prohibit objectionable behavior, where people treat somebody less favorably than another because of a characteristic, be it their gender, their race, their religion, or their disability. Unlike other grounds, disabilities is slightly difficult in the sense of, when it comes to gender, every single person in this room is covered by the legislation. When it comes to age, every single person in this room is covered by the legislation. When it comes to religion, and because it includes no religion as a characteristic, every single person in this room is covered by religion. Every single person in this room, or in all of the rooms, I should say this room, but all of the virtual rooms, is covered by sexual orientation. There are one or two exceptions in the equality legislation where not everybody will be covered, and disability is one of those. Arguably so is membership of the travelling community, and so is potentially family status when it's a caring responsibility. But most of the protected criteria apply to everybody in the room. So when it comes to disability, there have been three approaches to defining disability in non-discrimination law. There is the restrictive approach, which has been used by the UK and the US, where they kind of want you to meet certain hurdles. So they set it's a narrow definition of disability. So it's really only the most deserving of disabled people that get within the legislation. And this is fraught with difficulties and has been fraught with difficulties, which has resulted in changes in definitions, massive litigation. It makes litigation significantly more expensive. People are litigating about whether or not they're disabled enough to come within the terms of the legislation, and it defeats the purpose of the legislation. The purpose of this legislation is to prohibit discrimination. And so therefore the case should rise and fall on whether or not discrimination has taken place. And so this is the second kind of approach, which is the Irish approach, the purposive approach, this idea that we have a definition that isn't the barrier. The focus of any court case should be on, were those actions discriminatory? Has the person complied in that particular way? And that is the route that the Irish legislation has gone. There is a third approach. Mostly it's the non-definition approach, where we just don't define it at all within the legislation. And then you leave it to the whim of the courts, and it's not entirely clear. I wouldn't think it's the best approach, but it is the approach that the European Union took. And arguably that has changed more recently because of the UN Convention. So in the Irish context, we have two pieces of equality legislation. We have the Employment Equality Acts of 98 to 21. We have the Equal Status Acts of 2000 to 2018. They both define disability in more or less identical fashion. Some slight differences between the definition, but for all intents and purposes, they're the same. So if you're involved in employment, as the vast majority of you are, as HR managers, as people working in employment, it will be the Employment Equality Acts that apply to you. But I suppose also because this is in a head body as well, which does a lot of work in relation to higher education, the Equal Status Acts will also apply to any student in relation to these provisions. But I think it's important, and particularly the employment context, to just be aware that there's also European legislation on this. And the Irish Supreme Court have held that the Employment Equality Acts must be interpreted in light of the Framework Employment Directive, which in turn must be interpreted in light of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So we need to remember that the UN Convention is guiding our interpretations, and the UN Convention is firmly rooted in the human rights model and the social model of disability. So their focus is very much on what are the barriers to participation and how do we address those barriers. So I'm going to look at the actual definition, and I'm going to state this isn't a pretty definition, but it's still, I think it's a good definition. And I'll call it out. It's not, as I said, pretty, and it's quite a long definition, but I'll just very quickly, if I could, just go through it. So disability is defined in the legislation as the total or partial absence of a person's bodily or mental functions, including the absence of a part of a person's body, the presence in the body of organisms causing or likely to cause chronic disease or illness, the malfunction, malformation or disfigurement of a part of a person's body, a condition or malfunction which results in a person learning differently from a person without that condition or malfunction, or a condition, illness or disease which affects a person's thought processes, perceptions of reality, or which results in disturbed behaviour, and shall be taken to include a disability which exists at present, which previously existed but no longer exists, or which may exist in the future, or which is imputed to a person. So it is a long definition. It is most definitely not pretty, but it's effective. And I will take effective legislation over pretty legislation any day of the week, and this is an effective provision. So we'll just look at that in a little bit more detail if I could. So it is a broad biomedical definition, and I think it's actually quite an instructive to discuss that element of it first. When this was being drafted, there was quite a bit of criticism of this definition, and the minister of the day, who has just recently passed, Mervyn Taylor, argued, you tell me the person who is excluded by that definition and I'll consider changing it. And he wanted a broad, inclusive definition, and it is that. And it does work. And it stops the arguments being around, is the person disabled or not? the arguments in court are around, was there discrimination or not, which is what the legislation is set there to do, and that's what the argument should be. It also avoids reference to specific disabilities. Now, this happens in other jurisdictions where they list every disability they can think of, and then, of course, inevitably, you leave somebody out. So it doesn't get into that situation, or they consciously leave certain disabilities out where they think that there is some moral element to that disability. For example, they specifically leave out certain disabilities that are, in some jurisdictions that could be related to, I suppose, to HIV or AIDS, where they felt that there was some moral issue in the background. So it avoids all of that. The other really important element is that there's no threshold of severity. We're not asking, are you really disabled enough to come within the definition? And in the UK and in the US, they do get into those conversations. Are you 20% disabled, 30% disabled, 40%? And they try and break it down into percentages. And people who've taken litigation say that that element where they analyze the individual person in that kind of really cold statistical way is absolutely more devastation than the discrimination that gave rise to the case in the first instance. So the legislation, the equality legislation, shouldn't be damaging to the individual, but in the jurisdictions where they have that threshold of severity, that is the feedback from the provisions. We also don't have time limits. So unlike some jurisdictions where they say you must be disabled for 1, 2, 3, 4 years before you can come within the legislation, we don't do that. The other element of it is that we cover the social aspect of disability, because we refer to a future disability, a past disability, or an imputed disability. And we also cover discrimination by association. So sometimes people go, well, what does that mean, a future disability? Well, certain people have propensities, or it is argued that they have a propensity towards a particular disability. And in that context, people may be aware of it in advance and decide not to hire somebody in a particular situation. And I'm going to give an example that I heard about recently. In Premier League soccer, apparently the gene has been identified that shows a propensity towards a cruciate ligament injury. And they are now genetically testing footballers before they sign them, so because they may have this injury that would be damaging to them. So again, that's an example of a potential future, not a disability necessarily, but injury in that case. A past disability could be something like somebody who had maybe a mental health episode, in their late teens, early 20s. They've never had a second episode, or maybe they have, but people are aware that there was a period of hospitalization or a mental health episode, and maybe they're going to comment on, they're going to discriminate on the basis of that. And we've a number of cases on imputed disability and covering discrimination by association. So discrimination by association often relates to, and has related in case law, to somebody who may have a partner who's HIV positive. So people have then reacted to that person based on their association with another person with a disability. So the definition is broad, biomedical definition, with the social aspect brought in at the end. And I suppose the important element is, as the first, and I maybe bring us back a slide if I could, just for 2 slides, if I could. When I said that there was the non-definitional approach, the EU adopted that. Then that meant the courts of justice, when they were interpreting the Framework Employment Directive, had to come up with a definition of disability, which they did. And it was after the European Union ratified the UN Convention, which they've ratified in their own right. They said that the court interpretation was incorrect. And as a result, the European Union had to change their definition of disability. What's interesting is that the committee have said that our definition is most likely compliant with the convention. So again, it is seen as by the members of the committee as a good, solid definition, in that it doesn't seek to exclude people, and it is inclusive in that respect. So why is it important in the context of this conversation? And really, it comes to this last element, if I could. There's one, so the equality legislation prohibits direct discrimination on all 9 grounds. It prohibits indirect discrimination on all 9 grounds. There is one specific disability duty, and that is the duty to provide reasonable accommodation. Now, it doesn't have to be specific to disability. The concept of reasonable accommodation comes from legislation from the US in the 1970s, where reasonable accommodation was a legal requirement in relation to religious discrimination. In the Canadian context, reasonable accommodation applies to every protected ground, but for reasons that are known to the legislature back in the late 90s, early 2000s, they made the decision that it would apply to disability only. So the failure to provide reasonable accommodation to a person with a disability is deemed to be discrimination. And reasonable accommodation does cause employers quite a bit of concern. They wonder, are they getting it right or how they should go about it? It doesn't have to be difficult. It can be fairly straightforward. And I would break it down into a very clear two-step process. So the first is that there is a legal duty to provide accommodation. And as I said, the failure to do so is considered to be discrimination. The accommodation that you provide has to address the barrier to participation. Now, what that means in practice is that you need to know what is the person with disabilities barrier. And there's the easiest way to find this out. There's a really straightforward way, and that's to ask the question. And it's to ask the person, well, what is your barrier to participation and how can we address that? And I'm going to give an example. I have one of my classes. I had a class where I had 3 students with visual impairments. Now, had I made any assumptions, I would have been in trouble. Because one of the students used Braille, one student had used an e-reader, and one just needed enlarged font. And in that context, if I had made an assumption that, oh, I have 3 visually impaired students, therefore I must do A, I would have probably excluded 2 others. So it was by having the conversation with the 3 students that I realized what I needed to do. And for 2, I didn't need to do anything in the end, because I just had to send them the materials in advance and they could enlarge the font themselves and they could put it through the e-reader themselves. And it was the 3rd student that we had to address. So it is that no one size fits all for a person with a disability. It's an individualized reactive duty. So the duty to provide reasonable accommodation, once we agree that a person with a disability needs an accommodation, and again, not every person with a disability will need an accommodation, but some might. And it is a conversation that will trigger that. Then it is an individualized reactive duty. You must provide the accommodation that addresses the specific barrier to participation. So the second aspect of this is that we have to assess the impact on the duty bearer. So if, for example, you have an accommodation, and again, what I mean by this is that NUI Galway has 20,000 students and almost 3,000 staff. It has this massive annual budget. And let's say we then talk about another educational body, a local private creche that has 20 pupils in it. The impact of an accommodation on the creche could be significant. The impact in NUI Galway would be a drop in the ocean. So you look at the actual duty bearer and see, can they withstand the burden? And it is about that individualized response. So if we were talking in terms of a sign language interpreter for a student, we'll say as an example, for NUI Galway, they could afford it because that is a cost that is well within their budget. And, in that context, it should be something the university addresses. However, for a creche of 20 people, it may be a disproportionate burden. So again, you look at that individualized response. So when it comes to reasonable accommodations, it does require that case-by-case assessment. And that means having the conversation with the person with the disability to see what the barrier to participation is and see, can you address it? And I just would, I suppose, put one other comment in here in relation to it, which I don't have in the notes, but there is a body in the United States called the Jobs Accommodation Network, where annually they survey employers and they ask employers about the cost of accommodations, the extent of accommodations, how many people needed them, how many people with disabilities, and what, how disruptive were those accommodations. 95% of all accommodations were one-off requirements and they cost less than $500. There were 5% that had a more ongoing requirement and some that had a requirement more than the $500, but huge numbers of them actually required no input financially or change-wise. It was just about slightly changing the way systems worked. So it's about thinking about it really and being creative around it. They're not all cost intensive, but some will have a cost involved. So the definition of disability becomes important because it is linked specifically to the concept of reasonable accommodation. And in that sense, the word disability and that term disability has legal connotations that have to be understood in that context. So on that note, I'm going to let you, if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you so much, Shivaun. If you wouldn't mind stop sharing, that would be great. There are 2 questions.
Okay.
So I will first ask the first one. So is mental illness included in the disability definition?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And then the second one, would you agree that a less prescriptive legal definition of disability lends itself more to a social model? And can people self-identify as disabled, or do they still need medical certification?
No, is to the first part of that question. Could you just give me the first part again?
Would you agree that a less prescriptive legal definition is more lending itself to a social model of disability?
No, and I'll tell you why, because a less prescriptive definition means the courts will make that determination. And when courts have been left to make that decision, they go for a very medical model. We've seen it in the courts of justice of the European Union. We've seen it in numerous jurisdictions. I mean, I watch definitions as a matter of interest. And for example, recently, Jersey went for a kind of a less prescriptive definition, and then it went to the courts, and it fell to the courts to make that decision. And the courts went for an absolute medical model. When the courts of justice went for the medical model in the Shaka and Navas case, a really narrow definition. Bear in mind, at that time, the Advocate General was advocating a social model, the European Commission was advocating a social model, the European Parliament was advocating a social model. It hit the courts and it was a medical model that came back. I would never leave anything to chance to the courts. And I say this as a lawyer. Definitional issues you get in the legislation. So I absolutely wouldn't go for that. And there was a second part to that question. Self-identification, no, there would possibly, but actually, no, you don't necessarily need a medical report either. So the courts don't look for them as a general rule. If it's the court decision, they generally don't. Some bodies and employers do. They're arguably, if somebody is visually impaired, there isn't a need for a medical report. If they do, however, insist on it, yes, that would be part of it. And that is how I suppose it plays out in practice, is that one of the issues around reasonable accommodation is that the employers are entitled to have all the information at their disposal in making a decision around reasonable accommodation, and that can include medical reports. And so I can see the disadvantage to that for somebody that makes it more medicalized. However, the alternative is that the courts make the decision and nobody might come within the definition at all. So I think it's a balance, and in that context, I would definitely lean in favor of this definition.
And I just had a question myself, Shivaun. So I would do presentations, and I suppose you'd probably have seen the census 2016 and how they define disability. So they're saying that the Irish population has 13.5% of people living with a disability. But what I found really interesting with the census was it never actually defined disability. It asked people questions like, do you have a difficulty with hearing, walking, and all this? So, what's your kind of thoughts on that and how they defined it? Because when they're producing those reports, they're saying 13.5% of the population are disabled, but that may not actually be true. It could be less or more. Like, what's your kind of thoughts on that aspect?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the definition of disability in the Disability Act, it's incredibly narrow. And that's a provision that is about dealing with provision of services to people with disabilities. So I suppose it's one of those things, it depends on the context, which is what I said at the outset. What is the purpose of what you're trying to do? And disability is a social construct. We all know this. So it's not like, it is a social, it's what we determine as a society is a disability. To a certain extent, some are very obvious and we're very comfortable with. We're very comfortable with, people who are mobility impaired. We're very comfortable with the idea of visual impairments and hearing impairments as disabilities. And I suppose it's all those other elements then where people kind of get into discussions around it. So I suppose, what was the purpose of the census? What were they trying to achieve? I wouldn't necessarily agree with all their definitions for other grounds either, and how they define particularly ethnicity. So there are issues around those definitions too. And I think it's one of those things is that regardless, once you get into defining a term, be it disability, be it gender, be it religion, there will always be people not particularly happy with it. I don't think this is, as I said at the outset, it is not a pretty definition, but it's an effective definition. And I suppose that's the question, is what do you want this legislation to do? And if it's about prohibiting objectionable behavior such as discrimination, the definition should not be a barrier. And I definitely would not leave it. And this is no disrespect to the courts, but they don't have the expertise, and you have different judges and different days who will give a different interpretation of the same issue. So I would never leave the definition to them, but there will be different definitions in different contexts.
Brilliant. And there are a couple of more questions. We may not be able to get to them all, but just kind of one employment related question there. You spoke around kind of, I suppose, sharing of medical information. So the question here is, has there been any discussion around privacy and disability, and to the degree which employers can seek information regarding disability? So how much can they actually receive about a person's disability, or has there been any cases around that?
Yeah, so one of the things is that, so the duty is, so I'm trying to remember which is which. So my understanding is that, and I can never quite remember, I think it is an ex ante duty. So the duty to reasonable accommodation is triggered from the moment it is requested. And now there is some case law about where it should be preemptive, but there are rare circumstances when an employer or educator should be aware of it and preempt it. But that's quite a narrow context. So it is triggered on request. So at that point, it is a direct request for, well, okay, you say you need an accommodation. I will need the following information. It is a one-on-one conversation at that point. And so therefore there's broader privacy issues. If somebody refuses to divulge their information or refuses to divulge in that situation, the employer can't be expected to guess. So there has to be that level of trust in that context, that if I'm requesting a particular accommodation in a particular situation. So for example, I did request, I'll give an example of one I requested. I requested a standing desk because not a disability, but a bad back. And my employer sent me to an occupational health physician for that. I went to the occupational health physician because I went to the standing desk, which I did duly get. But it is that, situation. I suppose that just to be aware of one example, and I think it would be a good one for employers to become aware of. There's Lloyds Bank in the UK made an executive decision. They were costing how much accommodations costed them. They were costing how long it took for the accommodations to come into place. They were costing, the assessments that got involved and the level of dissatisfaction of their staff, because they were sending the staff for an assessment, and then that was taking time, and then there was reports coming back. So accommodations were taking up to 90 days to actually be implemented. So they decided to pilot a project where they didn't do the assessments, and they just provided every staff member that asked for accommodation. So what they said was their costs went down significantly, their satisfaction levels went up significantly, and the people who needed accommodations got the accommodations earlier. We shouldn't be viewing it as a barrier. These employees need accommodations all the time in different contexts. People get nervous around the disability one because it's a legal requirement. But if you think of your employees in different situations, particularly over the last few years, anybody who has been at home with children, your employees have needed assistance and accommodations at different times. And a lot of the time, reasonable accommodations are around that too. So I think not to think of it as a barrier, but maybe think of it in a more permissive way would also be appropriate.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And there's actually so many questions now. I don't know, Shivaun, maybe you could type some of the answers to some of the questions, and we do have to move on to the panel discussion. But just kind of the last thing, what you were saying around the cost of reasonable accommodation. Our own research in WAM, I suppose, when we do our needs assessment with our graduates going on placement, 2/3 of the accommodations all relate to work tasks, so how work is given. And very, very small proportion actually work costs. And in most cases, for example, if someone needed a larger monitor because maybe they had some site issues or whatever, that often was available in the organization. So it actually didn't really cost the employer anything. So there is that kind of assumption that it costs a lot of money, where actually it's about working differently,
Exactly. And just, I suppose, to go back to the example I gave about the standing desk, I have brought in a physiotherapist's report, and they send me to the occupational health physician. So straight off, there's 2 medical bills. And when the buildings arrived with the desk, I said, where was the desk? And they said, in a storage room. So we could have avoided everything and just said, if a staff member has requested and you have a storage room with them in it, why not just bring them? That would have saved time and cost. It is, a lot of the time, these things are very straightforward.
Yeah, brilliant. And thank you so much, Shivaun. And there are so many questions. I apologize.
I'll answer a few of them here now. So
great. So now I'd like to actually welcome our panelists. So if I could ask all of our three panelists to please turn their camera and mic on, or that would be great. I see we have everyone here. That's brilliant. So yeah, so I suppose this is the next 45 minutes or 40 minutes is going to be a panel discussion, and we have some amazing speakers and guest panelists here today. So first we have Suzy Byrne, and then we have Laocín Brennan, and we also have Amy Hassett. So I might just get you all to kind of just very briefly introduce yourself in 2 or 3 sentences. That would be great. So Suzy, could you kind of first kick off?
Thanks very much, Caroline, and it's great to be here and to join AHEAD today. When you said that AHEAD was founded in 1988, I remember 1988, and I remember the early years of AHEAD. And I remember also as a disabled student linking with AHEAD and encouraging people to link with AHEAD when in the mid-90s. So yeah, my name's Suzy Byrne. I'm an activist on disability issues. I also work for the National Advocacy Service for People with Disabilities as a regional manager. I'm involved in activism currently through my membership of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties as a board member, and I'm also appointed as a public appointment to the Board of Irish Rail as a disabled person. So that's me in a nutshell. Thanks.
Brilliant. And then next we have Amy. Would you please introduce yourself?
Hi folks, I'm Amy and I'm from an organisation called Disabled Women Ireland. So we are disability activists, and Disabled Women Ireland itself is what's called a disabled persons organisation, which is an organisation comprised, in our case, entirely of disabled people, and we speak and advocate on issues relating to disability.
Brilliant. And then Laocín.
Hello, I'm Laocín and I work for AHEAD as a team support officer. I'm here as the founder of the Neurodivergent Society in DCU, which is the first neurodivergent society, student society in Europe.
Brilliant. So today I have some questions that I will direct at certain people, and then I do have some more general questions, but there are some kind of questions and comments in the chat. We will keep an eye on those as well. So Suzy, I suppose as someone who's worked in disability activism and equality issues for over 30 years, you know, you have seen a lot of change. You mentioned you remember AHEAD in the early days, in the early 90s, mid 90s. And I suppose you've been there when the Equal Status Act 2000 was being implemented and all that. So, and I suppose that probably would have been groundbreaking somewhat at the time for people with disabilities. So I suppose, could you tell us a little bit about the changes you've seen from 30 years ago to now in around the language being used to describe disabled people or people with disabilities?
I think probably my first introduction to issues around disability was when I was involved in the Mary Robinson campaign, and I met Donald Tolan for the first time, and who was becoming very active on disability rights, and he was campaigning for the right of disabled people not to have to prove themselves sane in order to access the right to vote. And that was his campaign during the Mary Robinson campaign. And that brought about to me the whole issue of the language. And I didn't identify as somebody with a disability at that time, even though I had reasonable accommodations in second level. But I myself had difficulties around my own identity as a disabled person. And it was through my LGBT activism that I became more aware of issues around disability. And I also was involved in the Campaign for Equality, which was a campaign established to campaign for that equal status legislation, to negotiate with Mervyn Taylor. There's also, I suppose, on the offside of that was the Commission on the Status of People with Disabilities, which was published, in 1996, and it still is relevant today as it was then. There's a whole load in that it is because we are where we are because of what was in the Commission, but there's still a lot in the Commission that report is still really relevant. And I became very aware of those debates around language, because at that time you had people saying, oh, we are people first, or we are disabled first. And then you had people who are not disabled watching us all and going, why do you want to be called disabled? And that's still going on to this day. And then I was a mature student in college, and I became student union officer for students with disabilities in Trinity. And I spent time during my poorly attempted officership, I'll just say I was not the perfect SU officer, but trying to encourage people to self-disclose. because the stigma around self-disclosure, the stigma around people identifying and wanting accommodations or even being associated with disabled students, other disabled students. And as this is Invisible Disabilities Week this week, so I think it's really apt that we're having these conversations this week, because people at that stage in the late 90s were having huge difficulties seeking accommodations, being identified as disabled students. Now, I think where we're at today, and what in the last few years in particular, I've been so happy about, is that people themselves as people with disabilities, as disabled people, and I will float between both of these terms, okay, throughout our conversation today, but, you know, people have become more comfortable. Now, I'm not saying the stigma doesn't exist, of course it does, it's still huge out there. I think the challenges for non-disabled people in how to refer to disability, and I think we've had a lot of disabled people be ashamed about using the disabled term and reach for, look at what I can do, my able-bodied person. And then you have non-disabled people, employers, education establishments to concentrate on the ability and not the disability, which for many of us is as insulting, okay, to not recognize our disability and our identity as disabled people, which is very important to us. So I think it's a minefield. I get that, and I would say that to the employers, managers, fellow employees, people in third level institutions, further education. It is a minefield out there, but it's so important to have the conversation. I really love the fact that Shivaun in her presentation talked about ask people themselves how they want to be referred to. And then we will continue to build that culture where we are today, hopefully, and in the future, where people are okay about their disability. It is seen as something that is part of them and something that they are experts in themselves, in the accommodations that they need, and that it won't become a fuss or a fear or the fear of a legal case. Anyway, I'll stop now and let you move on, but that's the snapshot of 30 years and where we've moved on.
I love that, Suzy, you know, kind of that identity, because I myself have a disability, and like you, I've only in recent years kind of accepted that fact. I suppose I would have always, I still do, I suppose I'm deaf, you know, and I'm a sign language user, I'm part of the deaf community, and I was always told I'm a cultural linguistic minority. I can be that, but I can also be disabled, you know. So it's only in the last few years, even though I've worked in the head quite a long time now, and, you know, availed of reasonable accommodations all throughout second level and third level, but I kind of shied away from using that term because I felt it was really negative. But actually, I've just started to really go, do you know what? I do have one. And I'm kind of like proud to kind of wear that label now, you know, in some ways. So, you know, it's to see other people trying to avoid it, and particularly non-disabled people kind of like, that's not helping matters, you know. I suppose we'll move on to Amy, because it's actually quite a natural flow. So, Amy, you're here representing Disabled Women's Ireland, and I suppose Disabled Women's Ireland ran a social media campaign that I think myself and Suzy both kind of participated in. I suppose it was around the lead up to International Women's Day, and it was called Disability Isn't a Dirty Word. So can you explain why Disabled Women's Ireland initiated this campaign? You're on mute, by the way, sorry. You're on mute. You're on mute. Sorry, Amy.
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to say, yes, you both contributed, and they were fantastic contributions. I suppose why we ran it is essentially what both Suzy and you have just said. But I'll give you kind of some context of why we ran it, when we ran it, and what kind of provoked us to run this campaign. Because as a concept, the campaign idea of disability is not a dirty word has been around for much longer than our campaign. But the reason why we kind of wanted to do our own iteration of it was, so it was March 2021 when we launched the campaign, but we started thinking of it around kind of January, February of 2021, which was, I suppose, coming up on the first year anniversary of COVID. And we were starting to get some of the information on how people with disabilities had fared during COVID. Of course, the National Advocacy Service has released their own report today of a little bit more detail, but we'd started to get some information, and the answers wasn't very positive. Disabled people fared much worse, and during the first part of the pandemic. And around the same time in January and February, there was a lot of conversations when we were put back into this snap lockdown of, well, the phrase that kind of sticks in my mind was, well, COVID isn't that dangerous if you don't have an underlying medical condition. And if we set aside the fact that about 30% of us have some sort of underlying medical condition, in that phrase is embedded this idea that somehow disabled lives are less valuable and less meaningful than the lives of people who don't have a disability or aren't disabled. I also use language interchangeably. And this is kind of something which I suppose disabled people come up against quite frequently, this idea that disability is a negative thing and it somehow makes your life less meaningful or less valuable. And we've known this for years and decades and maybe even millennia, but it's a really pervasive idea and it's a really negative one. And fundamentally, if we can't view disability in a positive light, it's very easy for us to devalue disabled lives. And so the first step of that is not seeing disability as a negative thing, as embracing it as part of kind of human diversity and human experience. And even through the campaign, I mean, we asked people to reflect on what they felt about the phrase disability is not a dirty word, and how they felt to identify as a disabled person. And even, like, you know, we had loads of different kinds of submissions. We had written submissions, we had interviews, we had a video from yourself, other videos, we had artwork, and as well as kind of written submissions. And, you know, it's just this diversity of ideas, and each person who provided a submission came with a different perspective on disability, but all, I suppose, shared this feeling of disability is not a negative thing, it's not a bad thing, it's not something to be ashamed of. And indeed, identifying as disabled can be one of the most important things that a disabled person learns to do, and it helps us to understand who we are and how we interact with the world and how we operate within the world. And if we can't see disability, if we see disability as a negative thing, that becomes much more difficult. So we wanted to frame disability in a positive way, and kind of create that space for people.
And did you have, I suppose, any negative criticisms, or what was the reaction like from, I suppose, the general public? Was people kind of going, what, or could you elaborate on that?
Sure. I don't, based on my recollection, I don't remember much negative criticism of it. I think, you know, people are still a little bit uncomfortable about disability pride, and it still feels a little bit taboo, and it's like you're celebrating something that's a bit different. So I think there was a little bit of hesitancy in the general public. What I thought was, for me, the most impactful and most important aspect of the campaign was that was for, shall we say, the general public, or people who maybe don't yet identify as disabled. It was how they interacted with the campaign. And what we found was it was a very emotional campaign, to be honest, and the response to it. And what the most impactful thing was there were some people who had, say, things that might be a disability, if they're comfortable identifying as such, being more comfortable in identifying as being disabled. And, you know, the emotions that come along with that are very complex. But also it's kind of this sense of community that we saw, and people learning to accept themselves and understand and start this journey of identifying as disabled. That I think was the most impactful aspect of it, and it's a really important thing to do.
Yeah, and I think there's still a lot of learning around what disability is. I mean, Shivaun gave the presentation on the definition of disability, and someone asked if mental health is disability. Yes, it is. It comes under E, that section there with thought process. We even get that all the time in the head. I suppose we have our WAM program, but also we do work with students. And I remember this one time, me and my colleague, we went out to college and we did a presentation about a head, and it was actually to a room of general students, first year students, so non-disabled and disabled students. And one person asked questions, oh, I have dyslexia, does that mean I'm disabled? And I went, congratulations, now you are, you know, and they had no idea that they were disabled. And, you know, we had a conversation around, I suppose, are you getting any support? And was like, what do you mean? And they didn't even know that they could get reasonable accommodation or how it impacted on them. They just got this diagnosis, but no one ever actually sat the person down and kind of explained this. So it's really nice to hear that, I suppose, some people tried the campaign kind of then realize about their own selves and their own identity. So that's brilliant.
And the thing, sorry, just for us, is that we're not bound by the same kind of, we don't have to have legal definitions, but we have a very broad definition of disability. And we essentially say to people, if you think you're disabled because you have a reason for thinking that, and welcome to the club. And giving people that freedom to identify as disabled and not having them prove that they're disabled is one of the most powerful things that one of, I think, our greatest, so far legacies. And the legacy of that campaign is we had loads of people contacting us being like, oh, well, I have this thing and 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 I might have a little bit of this. Do I qualify? And we were like, you don't need to tell us. If you think you're disabled, if you have to ask the question, am I disabled? You're disabled. Welcome to the club. Let's help you understand how to navigate this and how to understand yourself in this context.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Amy. And I'll go to Laocín next. So Laocín, you mentioned you were the founder of DCU's Neurodivergent Society, the first of its kind in Europe. So could you explain what neurodivergent or neurodiversity is for some people who may not know what that term is?
Yes, of course. So I'll explain both terms. The first term that was coined was neurodiversity. That word was coined by Judy Singer, who was an autistic socialist in the 90s. She used that word to describe the diversity of human brains and to say that in any group of people, there are going to be people whose neurologies don't work normally, and that is kind of like biodiversity, that all humans are different, therefore all neurologies are different. Taking this kind of idea one step further, Kassian Asu-Masu, who is a multiply neurodivergent activist, came up with the word neurodivergent in 2013, I believe, on Twitter. And the difference between neurodiversity is about a group or a collective of people, and neurodivergent is an adjective for one person. And there are many different ways in which a person can be neurodivergent. The definition that I like to use is anyone who thinks differently from societal standards of normal or acceptable is neurodivergent. But people don't generally like that definition because it's as broad and inclusive as possible. That's why I love it. So just to give you a bit of a overview, that could include mental illnesses it does include mental illnesses such as depression and anxiety. It also includes sensory processing disorders, learning differences, things which are acquired over time, such as dementia and white matter lesions, and miscellaneous stuff that doesn't fit into those categories, but still is not neurotypical. So
brilliant. Yeah. Thanks. And I've actually learned something new as well, because I think those two terms are, I suppose, people use them kind of, like we're saying people with disabilities, disabled people, some people kind of use neurodiversity to actually mean neurodivergent. So that it's those two terms. And can I ask, Laocín, when you set up that society, I suppose, why was it important to have a neurodivergent society and not a disability society? Was there any particular reason as to why that, or why you went for that one?
Yeah, there are actually three reasons. The first and most kind of significant reason was because back in 2019, I think I founded it. I didn't personally feel I was disabled enough to use the word disabled. I kind of felt that I definitely fell under neurodivergent, but I was almost taking away from people who had visible disabilities if I said, oh yes, I'm disabled. I didn't feel like I qualified enough to actually represent people who had things other than neurodivergences, disabilities other than neurodivergences. So that's the main reason number one. And then number two was, it was a new word to me and a new word to most of the people who I spoke to. So I kind of thought there's more scope to make an impact in this movement because people haven't heard the word. So they don't have already this misconception or any bias anyway. So you can paint it in a positive way. And then the final reason is because there are disability socks across Ireland. I kind of felt like they kind of had the connotations already assigned to them when they were started. So it was kind of a multi-pronged of, if we start something that paints the disabilities in a way that is more neutral or positive, then that's going to make a greater impact, I suppose.
I love that, lady. I'm not disabled enough, and I think we probably all kind of feel that at one stage. You know, I certainly feel that I'm not deaf enough because I can speak and I can hear, and I do feel the impact of that from members of the deaf community because I can't speak and because I choose to speak and not sign or certain things. And it's a conflicting identity thing for me, but I 100% I am deaf, but sometimes it's perceived as not being deaf enough, you know. So I love how you kind of brought up that reference around, are you disabled enough as well, you know, because if they're hidden disabilities, which the majority of disabilities are, you know, and I think people need to remember that as well. I mean, in our employer attitude survey presentation we did last June, we surveyed over 250 employers and organizations, and we asked them what was the first word that came to mind when you hear disability, and wheelchair stood out. Like, that was the biggest thing that came to people's head, you know, blind, deaf, because it's something you see, that is the first thing that comes to your mind. But actual fact, if you look at the AHEAD's participation rates of students with disabilities, I mean, there's almost 16,000 students registered with the disability service in higher ed, and the majority, the first three disabilities are actually invisible disabilities, you know, and that equates for about 70% of the population. So I will move on now. I suppose one of the questions I had was, I think Suzy, you brought it up, and maybe Amy, you kind of brought it up as well, around that person first language versus identity first language. I suppose, is there any right way to describe a group of people with disabilities or disabled people, or, you know, what's your thoughts on that? So I don't know who kind of wants to take that first. Amy, I see your eyebrows going, so.
I'm indicating that Suzy can go.
Suzy, take it away.
The easy way to say is to ask people how they wish to be described, but there's a difficulty in that many people don't know how they wish to be described as well. Now, some people have very strong opinions, but other people are so unsure and unsafe themselves about things that they may not know how they wish to be described. And I think, well, in the last, I suppose, year to 18 months in particular, I've seen organizations get comfortable about getting out there and saying, we're going to use both terms. This is why, this is the basis for. So when they're writing a report or they're launching something, they're saying, we're using both terms. We recognize that there's a difference there in how people want to be referred to. We get now that people are becoming more proud about who they are, and that they also want to reflect that it is society that is disabling them more than their own differences, okay, that are the issues. So I think it is important to ask, but also I think it's probably important to examine what is happening around you in terms of the conversations that are going on. And when you are designing programs or preparing outreach or whatever that might be, is to be inclusive of those terms, but also not to run away from the dis word, okay? Which I hope that people will leave the session today to, you know, knowing that making up words, which a lot of people in the industry and many industries do, run away from the word so much that the term that they come up with, differently abled or whatever that might be, or dis in small letters and ability in big letters, or whatever it could be, you know, all of these things, they cause more barriers, you know, than they solve, you know. And if we don't, I mean, I've been in my job for a long time, so I'm not going looking for jobs or things like that, but I'm hoping that people, when they come to work in the organization that I work in, you know, will feel okay about seeking reasonable accommodation, but we'll also reach out and say, what assistance do you need? All of those conversations can be held openly, rather than, well, we don't want to pigeonhole you and we don't want to put you in a box, or we'd be afraid, you know, to actually admit or recognize that you have a disability. I think we've moved away from the reasonable accommodations although in law and with Shivaun has said why they are important and defined, but that's definitely broadened over the years as to what that is. A lot of people were afraid around the cost implications. Then they moved into the labeling implications. Now I just think it becomes, and I think that the pandemic has been important in that, health and safety law has been really important in that, that people say, okay, this is something we have to address. How we encourage people to be confident is the important thing. And that's something that we have to do in education, in the health sphere. I'm very, I wanted just to mention about the Disability Act and the narrow framing of the, that's a huge difficulty because of resourcing. One of the things I encounter a lot is the fact that people say they won't get support under services because they're seen as too mild, or that mainstream services should be able to support people, and that isn't happening. So there's a lot of work we need to do on the categorization of disability, which happens in service provision under the Disability Act, which is a different thing, as Shivaun said, from the Equality Act definition. And we also need to look at the supports for adults who may not have been able to get support and so-called diagnosis or assessment when they were young. That's a huge barrier for people, and we need to look at how we support people to get an understanding of what their support needs are, so that they are then confident in approaching employers and education and outlining those things and learning and finding about. I was the same in the mid-90s, that I finally, to somebody said it was a computer that I needed. And then as I moved on with mobility issues, there were other things, you know, but I was able to get that assistance. I know that it's very difficult still for a lot of people to get the assistance. They hide, or they, well, so-called passing, I suppose, is the language that people use. Many people just get through things and don't get the supports that they need. And we need to look at how we support adults through some sort of, if it's not in education, that you know, we have career guidance or other types of supports that helps people identify what their needs are, so that they then, I mean, AHEAD is very good at that, but for people who might be well removed from the education sphere, that they have access to some sort of service that can support them to know what their needs are, so that they become confident in using the language and seeking that their needs are met.
Brilliant. And Amy, Laocín, do you have any thoughts around that person first, identity first language? Suzy kind of gave a great explainer, but I wondered if you two want to add on anything to that?
Yeah, briefly. What do you identify as was a kind of listed as under the person first or identity first language. For me, I have several disabilities, so I actually identify as both depending on which disability it is, but I don't hold anyone else to that because it's so complex that it actually just changes. Like, I'd never say I'm a migraineur, I'd say I have migraines. And there's kind of two reasons for that. The first one is nobody really knows what a migraineur is, except for migraineurs. It's kind of a niche term. And then another thing is it doesn't really affect me other than when I am in pain. So I like to think of it as something separate from me, whereas I can't really do that with, say, autism is another one of my disabilities. I'd say I'm autistic rather than I have autism, because I'm always autistic. It's not something I can kind of detach. So yeah, that's just something on how it might be different for different disabilities.
I love the fact that you've got like specific terms that you use within your community, because in the deaf community we call each other deafies, but like hearing people are not allowed to use that term, you know. So that's another kind of thing around language. What's appropriate for me to say about members of the deaf community may not be appropriate for anyone else to say about the deaf community, you know. So the language is just so complex. This is a minefield, and that's why it's a conversation about this, and it's not a lecture to educate people and tell you should be doing this or this or this, because everyone is different. Amy, do you have anything else you want to add on to that?
The only thing I would add is, well, I think, you know, asking people what they like to be called is really important. In the absence of having that opportunity, I would encourage people to use both. The reason being that there are certain communities within the disability community that prefer certain terminology over other terminology. And sometimes if I were to say here and go use disabled people, there are some people within the disability community that would feel excluded by that. and vice versa. So I would just say use both. And DWI, we use both, and I myself use both. And I just think in the absence of having that opportunity to talk to somebody and ask them as a kind of baseline, that would be
brilliant. And how are we for time? I see we have another kind of 10 minutes left. So I think Shivaun kind of touched on that kind of consequences around not using the word disability. I suppose she kind of explained why it was important to use that. But in your own opinion, what do you think the consequences could be if employers do not use the word disability? I mean, I've seen words like Suzy, you mentioned that diff-ability or ability or people of all abilities challenges, rather than actually using the word disability. So what do you guys think about what the consequences would be for maybe new people coming into the organization or current employees?
I think fundamentally when we don't name disability, it makes it much more difficult to be honest and open and provide those, like, provide reasonable accommodations. It's like, let's just talk about it. And if we don't use terms like disability in these contexts, and I hate like diff-ability, disability, additional needs, special needs, differently abled, all these, I think they're awful. Because what they show is that we don't fundamentally sit down with disabled people and talk to them, because I know very, very few disabled people who are comfortable with these terms. And I think we just need to be able to name it to actually provide reasonable accommodations and not let it be, like, it comes back to kind of not allowing disability or not framing disability as a negative thing. And when we don't name something, we're inherently ascribing a negative meaning to it. So you have to name it, and then that, I suppose, indicates that there's scope within there to view it in a non-negative way and provide those accommodations.
Great. Suzy, Laocín, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just want to recognise the amount of goodwill that there is to supporting people and wanting to do the right thing, and also that organisations want to be seen as employers that are open and accommodating and inclusive. And I think that in organisations want to communicate that, you know, and they want to, you know, there's so much work that is great work that's being done on equality, inclusion, diversity, that we just need to move that one step further to, in communicating how inclusive and open an organisation is that how it recognises and wants to support people to be who they are, not to fix the issue, which, you know, of course, providing people with accommodations does fix the discrimination or assists in that, but also just in letting people be who they are and helping them develop into who they become. So we see that language used in other minorities and I'd love to see that happen in disability, about letting us be who we are and who we can become, rather than in fixing the disabling culture or allowing us to become more normal, which, you know, okay, people don't use that, hopefully don't use the N-word a lot, but I think there's a lot of the work that goes into diversity inclusion, which is about level playing fields rather than recognizing difference and helping people celebrate and be comfortable with, you know, their disability. And I'm hoping that that's what we'll move into. But I do want to recognize that there are lots of people working really hard on this issue, you know, so I think the time is ripe, you know, to keep this going so that we can make people feel proud about themselves, which I think is a lot of where we've moved to now, and it's great to see. Thanks.
Brilliant. Laocín, do you have anything you want to add to that?
A little bit. It's just when you ask the question, it specifically said when employers avoid the term disability. And I think it kind of comes back to, if they're the employer, they're kind of a figure of authority. And if the employer is awkward around the word of disability, it perpetuates from a place of not superiority, but from a place of authority, how the entire organization will view using the word disability. So it's kind of an added responsibility there if you are, you know, high up.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Laocín, because it's like the top-down approach. If you don't get buy-in from the top and whatever language they're using, that will filter down through the masses, And we do have to remember people acquired their disability during their working life. So, like I would have been into many different companies in the past, and I suppose I would have done a lot of training with hiring managers and with talent acquisition, HR staff. And when I talk about disability and I make reference to particular disabilities such as diabetes, for example, or epilepsy, there's looks of shock on their faces and go, what? That's a disability? And I said, yes, technically under the legal term, it would be considered a disability. And you as an employer have to provide reasonable accommodation for that particular employee. And they were shocked about that, So I think it really, if the kind of powers that be, if it's coming down promoting the word disability and perhaps giving some case studies or explaining kind of what supports the employer could provide in these different kind of instances, that will filter down to, I suppose, people on the ground. I'm just conscious of time. We are coming up to the 1:45 mark. Don't really want to go any later than that. But I suppose you've all been brilliant, and I really do appreciate all of your time today. But do you have any closing comments or closing statements that you want employers to take away today? So I might start with you, Suzy.
I would just, I suppose, echo again the issue of people not being afraid to ask and to support people to develop their own comfort around language. And that I hope that this conversation will continue. I hope, and I think it would be important to mention the UNCRPD, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and the way in which that frames disabled people as the experts. And people to be consulted about things. And I think one of the things that's really been great is the development of disabled people's organisations, who again in the last 30 years have had a trajectory of developing, becoming exhausted, whatever. We're in a peak at the moment, and hope it keeps going up, of disabled persons organisations across all types of groups. And it's great to see, groups of self-advocates coming together, people in terms of people in neurodivergent communities coming together, and that hopefully will continue to add to the conversation and the comfort and the pride. And thanks a million for the opportunity. I really appreciate it, and good luck to everybody in all the work that they're doing.
Thank you, Suzy. Amy, any final words or final thoughts for employers?
I fear repeating myself, ditto what Suzy said, but I think the key thing for me is trust disabled people. We have lived good portions or all of our lives with being disabled, and we know I can cut through a lot of red tape if I am just trusted to give meaningful input on what is a reasonable accommodation and how to navigate my disability. And it's the same for every disabled person. We know what works. We can do it quite quickly, quite rapidly, quite low cost if you just listen to us. Yeah.
Brilliant. And last but not least, Laocín.
I've just seen a question here that I'm going to answer. I've always preferred neurodiversity as a term. By arguing that there is a neurological typical, aren't we perpetuating an unhelpful normal? This is something I've thought about and talked about at some length with various friends of mine. And what I realize is there is no actual brain that is neurotypical. It doesn't exist. We all think differently. However, there is a societal ideal of neurotypical, and there is a huge portion of the population who don't get called ableist slurs because they can pass or mask, or don't even have to mask enough, that they're close enough that they can perpetuate this unhelpful normal and this unhelpful ideal anyway. So I think also there's been a term that's been going around, neuronormal, as opposed to neurotypical. I personally hate neuronormal as a word, because typical just means like the most common, like that's typical of whoever. It's what they most often do. So I think it would be ideal if neurodivergent wasn't needed as a word, because we all respected that neurodiversity was a thing. But I'm quite a practical and pragmatic person, so I have to realize that there actually is a stigma against neurodivergent people, and there is that unhelpful taught that we are a minority and that we're not like normal or ordinary or whatever. So I suppose the term does reinforce the idea of, well, if there's a divergent, there must be a convergent, there must be a normal. But I also think that we're not far enough in society that we can reasonably think that that normal isn't already there, or that standard isn't already there. So I hope that helped.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Laocín, and thank you to all of our panelists and speakers today. So I'm actually going to ask my colleague Tanisha to share a link to the SurveyMonkey into the chat, because as always, your feedback is so important to us. Our next webinar is actually taking place next month. So I'm just going to share my screen just to kind of go through the next one. So here we go. So yeah, so our next webinar is taking place on the 24th of November at 11:30, our usual time. And we are going to be looking at brain awareness and neurological conditions with a particular focus on epilepsy. So we have our guest speakers from Neurological Alliance of Ireland and Epilepsy Ireland. And if you want to register, the link is on our website to do so now. So it's ahead.ie/WAMinar, and you can register on the link there. So thank you everyone so much for coming along, and thank you to my colleagues in Ahead, and thank you to PCR for the captions as well, and also Dr. Shivaun Quinlivan, who had to leave a bit earlier. So thank you very, very much everyone, and thanks for watching.